welcome to this press conference for George Miller's 3,000 Years of Longing. And on behalf of United Artists Releasing, I'm very excited to be your host for the next half hour. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our distinguished panel for today. So without further ado, please welcome the maestro himself, the writer and director of 3,000 Years of Longing, George Miller. And we're also joined by Tilda Swinton, who plays Alethea in the movie. And finally, the Djinn himself, Idris Elba. Now, as always, I'll kick us off with a few questions to get us started. And of course, we'll take as many from you as we can in the time allotted. So feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A function in your Zoom windows. And so, George, I think the best place to start really is with you. This film is based on a short story, of course, by A.S. Byatt, and the idea to turn it into a feature has been brewing for a very, very long time. So I wonder if I can ask you what it was in the story that you reacted to, and why you wanted to make this movie so much that it kind of survived the decades of gestation.
Well, I guess the simple answer, in a relatively short story, it's more a novella, about 140 pages. It was so loaded with material, and most of it was kind of paradoxical. I mean, it's a story that's set in a hotel room. It's a conversation that happens over a relatively short period of time, and yet the content basically is across 3,000 years. It's a story, it's a fairy story, and yet it seemed to have a lot of truth in it, which again, it is very, very interesting. So, then you have two characters. One is a creature, a scholar, a creature of reason, and the other is a creature of emotion and desire. And one is very mortal, and the other, it can live indefinitely. So, and ultimately, it's about, I guess, about stories and what they do to us, and in particular, love. That's a pretty rich meal in a relatively short story. So that's on the surface of it. Deeper down, it just is a story once read, for me at least, I just couldn't forget.
Well, and you know, I mean, you're talking about those contradictions there. It is very much the definition of a George Miller chamber piece, which is that it also takes place over 3,000 years and goes to so many brilliant worlds. But kind of at the heart of it is that chamber piece, and it is the interaction between these two characters. So I have to ask, I mean, you've chosen two of the most accomplished performers on the planet to pull it off. What was it about Tilda and Idris for you that kind of made them the right people for this story?
I don't want to embarrass them speaking about them direct. Look, they to both of you, in a single word, they're apart from their skills and talents, is their charisma, and by charisma I mean there is that thing that we, whatever it is, in humans, in any creature, that we're intrigued by both their accessibility and their reserve of mystery. I think that's the simplest way. What's really interesting, and Idris and Tilda both know the story, until I actually met them in person, I sort of knew them from the movies and the television and the work that they both done, but I had no idea who they were outside of the characters I'd seen them play. And I was lucky enough to meet them, you both, and almost within Tilda for a longer period, we happened to be at the same dinner at one time, and we had a lovely chat, and Idris only for a few minutes in London at some event. But the moment I met both of you, I'll speak to you directly. The moment I met both of you, I was struck by how vivid they were as people, their normal personas, and once that happened, I couldn't think of anybody else. We're still working on the screenplay. So lucky enough, sometime later, I sent the screenplay to Tilda first, and Tilda was enthusiastic, and then the same with Idris. So, yeah, couldn't think of, there was no one else for me, and the experience of making the film for me verified that enormously.
Well, I mean, Tilda, I think one of the things that surprises me watching the film is how quickly Alethea is prepared to kind of go on this journey of storytelling with the jinn. I mean, there's the kind of the initial surprise of his sort of emergence from the lamp, but you know, very quickly she doesn't completely freak out. She's ready to find out about this man, and I think that speaks to a great curiosity inside of her. But what do you think it kind of says about her? What kind of appealed to you about that curiosity about this woman?
I think that's the right word. I think curiosity is absolutely right. She says quite early on, she's very self-aware, and when she's sort of describing herself to the jinn, she declares very early on at the border, you know, I am someone who I find feeling through stories. She's someone who's sort of set out her stall for herself in a fairly sort of finite way. I'm going to be someone who is, you know, not going to feel much on my own account, but I'm going to find feeling through the stories of other people's lives. And she also admits or reveals to the jinn very early on that she has a sort of predilection to believe non-rational stuff. She might be a rational individual, but she talks about this early relationship with a boy, Enzo, who was her sort of companion, her, one might say, imaginary friend, but someone who really supported her psyche when she was a young person. So she's very aware that she's sort of given to this sort of curiosity. And I think it's literally a dream for her to be sitting in this room with this jinn who's prepared to tell his stories, and, you know, provides her some fantastic snacks, and she just sits down and opens her ears and follows. But you're right, it's her curiosity. This is an important sort of emblematic part of her nature, that she's truly curious.
Well, and Idris, we've seen so many sort of, you know, stereotypical ideas of what a genie is, who a jinn is, you know, over the years. I wonder, in your conception, kind of what you made of what George and Augusta had done with this character, and also how you wrap your head around playing a character like this, because I think one of the things that comes across in the film is that the jinn knows his power, he holds his power, and you feel that throughout the story.
Yeah. You know, I think that the George and Augusta's version of the jinn was, you know, I wouldn't say page one, but it was, you know, very much, you know, digested, internalized, thought of, and really setting out to be unique in the spectrum of jinn storytelling, you know. And that was on the page before I even got there. And then when we sat around a room for weeks on end, years, in fact, 2 years probably, kicking this around, all of the stuff that, you know, George and Augusta had laid down as a foundation, and the originality of this character began to spring and grow. My influence, Tilda's influence, George's, you know, our collective influence started to build the sort of framework of what became the performance, you know. It was really important to me, actually, to veer away from anything that we may have seen before, because I think this character's journey is only really believable to the audience if we feel like we have never seen anything like this before, isn't it? It's kind of like the audience are going to go, oh, okay, funny story, haha, tell me a joke, do the wish thing, you know, do the magic thing. But I think you are engaged in this character to the point where, quite cleverly, George makes you want to ask, is he real or isn't he real? And that's, you know, obviously the device that we end up with in the back at the end of the film. So yeah, you know, it was really important that we did that work. We nurtured that telling that version of him. And as an actor, it was a gift, just a complete gift. Like, go ahead, there you go, create something. Yeah.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was your suggestion that the flashback sequences be shot before the scenes in the hotel. Is that right?
Yeah, it was. It was a bit of a spanner for poor George. He's like, well, we hadn't figured to do it that way, but it's a good idea. But yeah,
it was a brilliant idea. It was almost the second thing you said to me. You said, yes, I'd like to do the movie, which of course made me really happy. And then you said, would you mind if we shot all the stories first, so that when I'm finally in the hotel room, I've experienced them to some degree, so I can tell Tilda's character. And I thought, my first thought was, damn, why didn't I think of that myself? And secondly, boy, I'm working with a real filmmaking actor here. Someone who thinks much more about the film than just his role. So that was a very memorable moment for me. It was almost the second thing you said. And then the third, and I don't know if you remember this, well, I think you might. You said you happened to be talking in a car on the way to the airport. And you said, George, I've got to get to the airport. I'm at the airport, but I'll call you back as soon as I can. And then I think a couple of hours went by and my phone pinged, and there was a photograph of you and Tilda sitting on the lawn of Tilda's farm in Scotland, where you were going to DJ, I think, at Loch Ness that night. Just by pure coincidence. I still don't know whether you ever met each other before, but what a memorable phone call. Already thinking about the film and already meeting the person you're going to be working with, as you say, a bringing together of your intuitions, which really enhance the film enormously. Served it really well. So anyway,
it was a brilliant idea. And at the same time, it takes George Miller to catch that at the air and make it happen. And it served all of us, I think. I mean, I think, George, it probably served you and the entire crew as well.
Oh, big time. It was the only way to do it. And I can't believe, as all the time I've been working on it, I didn't even think of it. I didn't know. I'm not sure I can't remember what I was thinking, but anyway, that was one of those moments, and it's so simple now. So just so you know, we shot everything before. This was during the pandemic, but before a Christmas break, and then Tilda arrived on the hotel set, and by then we cut most of the stories, and so not only we were able to sort of, just before we would shoot the scene, we were able to show Tilda what Idris was talking about and so on. So it was very, very useful. Thank you.
Well, and then you go into these incredible moments of intimacy in the hotel, and I'd really like to get a sense from all of you, really, about the atmosphere of creating this kind of like this developing love affair between these two characters on set, working in, as you said, George, it was during the pandemic. I imagine there weren't a huge number of people around. Describe for us, if you would, just what that kind of collaboration was like when you were all on the hotel set. Maybe Tilda, you could kick us off there.
Well, as Idris mentioned, we'd already been having this conversation, chewing this cud for years, in fact. We had a very fruitful and enjoyable week in London the year before, when Gussie and George and Doug Mitchell came over, and we just threw it all around together around a big table in a hotel room in London. And And then we were, thanks to, it was Skype in those days and now it's Zoom, we were able to keep it going. We were able to keep the conversation going as if we were in the same room. And then when Idris and I both arrived in Sydney after Christmas, well, you went home for Christmas. And so I arrived for the first time and he arrived for the second time. We were in quarantine in the same hotel. In fact, we were in adjoining rooms. And we had a big Zoom session every single day. I think our record, George, one day was 9 hours of cud chewing. We did a 9-hour session one day. We just talked and talked and talked through every syllable of the script. And so all to say that by the time we got onto the set with a camera, we really had sort of seen underneath the surface of the water at the whole iceberg. And we really had a sense of confidence, I would say, about what the decisions we'd made. And we felt quite, sort of settled. Having said that, and this is again, the great George Miller, having said all of that, we still felt free at the last minute to try fresh things, even though we'd been making decisions for months and coming to choices. We still felt very open and free to sort of bat it back and forwards in different ways through the takes. So it was, it was really wonderful, that long trajectory of just chewing it.
Mm. You get to know people when you kick it around,
Yeah.
There's a lot of vulnerabilities that you share with each other. I was a huge fan of Tilda for a long time before we even met. And then we're in a room sitting opposite each other, discussing things about acting. You kind of go, it's like being in space and taking your first breath without a helmet. You're like, whoa, is this actually happening? And then it's a reciprocal feeling. Tilda feels equally as, welcoming and open and nervous. And, her offering is as pure as it gets, as like George was, and he's finally got his actors in the room after writing meticulously each word. And then Tilda will come and say, I think this, and I think this. So all of that vulnerability offers up an experience where you all feel quite, safe.
Yeah.
As actors, we dread being stale. We want it to be fresh a lot. We want it to feel like the first time you're saying these words. And you can only do that essentially when either you're absolutely improvising and you don't know anything you're about to say, or you know the text so well that you can kind of say it whispered and someone will go with it. You know what I mean?
Mm. And also both Idris and I very quickly, I think, shared with George that we were both at the same stage, I think, in our work. We wanted to do something different. We both wanted this piece of work to take us into slightly fresh snow, and George was so up for that. I mean, he wanted that too, and the way you do that is you sort of go around all the corners and you put the torch into every single, under every bit of wainscoting, and you just bore yourself with all the old stuff. and then you can just leap and do something different.
And you make up a new language.
And you make up a new language.
Yes.
With gold ears. Yeah. On top of all of it. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to turn now to the audience. We have a question here. She asks, you've all been involved previously with films that use mythology and folklore to tell modern stories. Can you talk about using these types of legends to speak to audiences and how they're amazing tools for actors and artists? George, do you want to take this one?
Well, as I tried to say earlier, one of the paradoxical things of this story is that it asserts itself as a fairy tale, but what really the advantage of, or the benefit of telling it through telling these kind of stories through fairy tales is that you're working with metaphor and symbolism that can be read by each person who happens to be experiencing the film according to their own worldview and make their own meaning of the thing. And at the same time, they're sharing meanings with the collective. It's what we all do in one way. When the story is open to the interpretation of each audience, each member of the audience, then they're invited to experience it. I think that's why we tell stories, and this is a long tradition of storytelling about animals. It allows us sometimes to abstract them and yet take the poetic meaning from them. So that certainly was a big attraction in this story, and I think, to be quite frank, all stories. I think even the documentaries that somehow stick in the mind are the ones that have that poetic dimension in some way. Even sporting stories or political stories or stories that we think are just a normal reporting of events, the ones that are most powerful, the ones that stay somehow and become part of the zeitgeist and a mythology, are those that have those kind of allegorical dimensions, either deliberately or unconsciously. So that, I mean, that was one of the big gravitational pulls of this story for me.
And we have a question of Tilda and Idris. How do you regard George as, this is your chance to embarrass this man right here. How do you regard George as a director, and what have you learnt about him while making this film? Tilda.
I was inclined to love George Miller from, I think, I'm trying to remember the first film that I'd seen. I mean, I suppose it was Babe. But when I first met him, and I'm both embarrassed and delighted to tell you that when I first met him, I didn't know that it was George Miller, this extremely nice person I sat opposite at a sort of official lunch in Cannes, where I was very shy and didn't really know anybody, and sat down in front of this very nice looking person. We started talking, and it was only after about 15 minutes that I realized it was George, who by that stage was a great, great idol of mine. But that says a lot, that it took me 15 minutes to know that I was sitting with my idol, because he is one of the most loving, communicative, interested, curious people you can ever meet. And I have the privilege to not only know him, call him colleague, but to say that he's really my friend. He's quite extraordinary. And as a filmmaker, he's truly a master. I mean, he really knows cinema and how to work it as a machine. In a way that, I don't know, my sort of simplest way of saying it is that I was not fortunate enough to live at a time when I could have worked with Hitchcock, but I worked with George Miller. That's that's really like move over Alfred Hitchcock, really, for me. He absolutely understands cinema and the way to work a camera, the way to tell a story with a camera, like nobody else, I would suggest. And so it's one of the privileges of my life to work with him, and one of the joys of my life to have him as a friend.
Oh, Tilda, it's such a funny thing to say. Most of what you said about me then, I have to throw straight back at you, because as I've said, many times, I feel I'm a inaugural member or a nascent member of the Tilda Swinton Director Club, of which there are many wonderful directors, and most of them lucky enough to have worked with you several times. there's a kind of an addiction that I must have about working with Tilda Swinton.
Well, we've only just begun. So this is...
Okay.
Idris, what about for you?
I'd be very quick. Filmmaking is a series of layers, if you like. Each layer offering a different sort of perspective on a story. Lighting, special effects, acting, sound, coloring. And what I learned about George, although it's evident that when a George Miller film shows up, you're expected to see something quite marvelous storytelling. But what I learned about George is that each one of those layers, George is an absolute master of each layer, including acting. Even though he will say, I don't know much about acting, but he's an absolute master in each one of those layers. And you have to consider there are a huge amount of layers that can make the image of a film or a scene or a story. And for some, it might be the smallest thing about a special effects artifact that exists only to the director's eye and perhaps the creator. And George will be an expert in that. And then to an inflection or a hum or or an eyebrow or a point of view when someone's listening, George will have a perspective on that. And honestly, that's what I learned. Obviously, seen in the films, it, but when you watch the man in work, like I have ambitions to direct one day, and I told him that it was without a doubt his going to work with him every day was an absolute masterclass. It was like the best seat in the best film university you could ever have. It was amazing.
Well, just again, as I listen to you talking, you got no idea how much I learned from you. Example, the very second sentence you said in our first conversation. So, oh boy, okay, I can finish my career right now having heard all.
Don't you dare.
Look at the next one, sorry.
Well, we've just got time for one last question. For Idris and Tilda, besides George Miller, what was it that made these roles irresistible to you? Idris, why don't you kick us off?
Well, as a character I had never attempted or wanted to even try doing. It was controversial in the sense that genie is one thing, jinn is another thing altogether. And to depict a jinn is like saying, I'm going to play the devil versus an evil spirit. Do you understand? And so for me, taking on the jinn was very, very sort of like, well, okay, I'm going for that. As an actor, the challenge is to bring that into life with an entertaining spin, but with a certain amount of authority. I know nothing about jinns or genies. So that was also, quite attractive to me. And also I got to create an accent that before this film, I think didn't exist based on, phonetically. It might sound similar to things we may have heard before, but the work that we did in order to create his voice was really exciting to me. I love, how I sound and not how I sound, but I love to manipulate how I sound to sound like a different character. So yeah, that's it.
And Tilda?
I would say that it's I can't escape acknowledging that I've had the fun in my life to work with a number of stories about immortals, but I have tended to play the immortal, and the great opportunity here was to play the human, was to play the mortal in the face of the immortal. And that was definitely a fresh road for me. To this person that Alethea is really a departure for me. She's someone that I feel I know, but I didn't necessarily always feel I knew her. I sort of know her now because I've seen the film. But she had to be built a little bit. And we all we all work together to build her. Because she's the point of entry. She's the avatar for the humans in the audience. And that was really an interesting new road for me. You know, I've played the supernatural exotic before, but not that point of attachment. And that was really interesting. And so to find, again, as Idris says, and this was a similar journey for me as well, it would be quite easy to work with a kind of stereotype with Alethea, just as it would be easy to work with a stereotype with the jinn. An academic of a certain age, a woman who lives by herself, we can immediately see all the dangers. And to negotiate those dangers and to work with them and to try and avoid them was the task that we all set ourselves to in relation to Alethea. And to make her someone who was, the story is that she has shut herself down to a certain extent. She has, made her decision to live alone, to not have desire, and to be intellectual, to be rational, above emotional. And yet, at that point in her life, to feel herself change. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of that being a sort of slightly scary stereotype. And we were aware of that always. And just to try and negotiate that was really an interesting sort of daily workout for all of us.
Well, and on that note, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. So it only remains me to thank the three screen immortals we have before us. Tilda Swinton, Idris Elba, George Miller, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Lots of love. Stay well.